Welcome to Series 4 of the Understanding Boys podcast. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast is recorded, the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to leaders past, present and emerging. In this series, we're talking with amazing mums. We ask their tips, advice on how they raise their boys, all the while leading successful and diverse lives. As usual, we ask our questions of what is it to be a good man these days? And if you had a story that you could tell a 14-year-old boy and he'd listen, what would the story be? I'm Dr. Ray Swan, and we're a community of teachers and parents concerned with the education and growth of boys in the modern world. The series is brought to you by Bryden Grammar, an all-boys school based in Melbourne, Australia. Joining us on the podcast today is Maree Crabbe. Maree is Project Director at It's Time We Talked. She's worked with young people and issues affecting young people for nearly 30 years, developing and delivering programs across a whole range of health-related areas, including sexual violence prevention, sexual diversity, pornography, and the list goes on. In our conversation today, we talk a bit about the raising of boys and the impact of pornography, how it's been normalised, things that may surprise us a little bit, and also, importantly, steps that we can take to ensure that we're raising the healthy boys we need for this age. I hope you enjoy the conversation today. Maree, thank you very much in advance for your time. You've been working with issues affecting young people now for, I was looking it up, it's actually nearly 30 years. How does that feel?
Feels like a long time, but great.
Yeah, great. And lots of wisdom there as well. And across your career, obviously working, in academia, but also in parent programs, working with schools, developing school content, which I'm sure we'll get into. But also, I guess, variations around the theme of really helping to raise, the healthy kids and the healthy adults that we need for this age to address some of the key, societal challenges that really still face us in terms of, equality and gender and all sorts of things that we're going to get into today. And I also think a bit of a theme in your work more recently has been around technology and how technology is providing access in all sorts of ways that parents may or may not be, they might sort of know on one level, but maybe they don't really know in terms of the developmental milestones, the impact of some of this stuff that can have on kids. I suppose my first question, just by way of interest, was, it's a big amount of work. What took you into it? What's driving some of your passion?
So I've been working in sexual violence prevention for a bit over 20 years. And I ended up moving towards working in addressing pornography's influence because in my work with young people, they repeatedly told me that as the internet became more accessible, pornography was becoming part of how they were learning about sex, and not very many people were having conversations with them about that. There was this sense of this emerging influence that lots of the adults in young people's lives had no idea about. And when I talked with them and heard what they were seeing and how it was impacting on them, and then read the literature around that, I thought it's really important that we support young people to navigate that influence.
Do you think, considering this, I'll go back, someone sent me one of those, I don't know if they're called memes these days, like a little clip of, remember the day, back in the 70s, back in the 80s, back in the whatevers, the innocence of all of that. And it just seems like such a big problem that, with a few notable exceptions, that people aren't really still talking about this enough. The idea that, boy, back in the day that you'd just be able to go into, your mum or dad's room and find and look at and do whatever, it'd be no way. But now we just sort of say to kids, look, with tech, you can just, there's your phone and good luck.
Yeah, I think the shifts in society in the last couple of decades are so enormous. We're still struggling, running behind, the tech industry really to work out how we should respond, if we should respond, what it looks like to kind of try to shape a civilized society, if you like, in an environment where young people can access, live streaming of massacres or people being beheaded or, suicide promotion content or explicit pornography. a whole range of material that, uh, and I'll talk a little bit about why pornography might fit in that category, but a whole range of material that should create in a viewer um, concern, like an empathic response, concern about what's going on the screen. But if you're saturated in all sorts of content and it's incredibly accessible and you are removed from where those events are occurring, then there can be a sort of a normalization or an acceptance or a desensitization of what those things really mean.
Absolutely, and it's interesting as you're talking. There was a couple of points that you get into. There was this sort of removing of the empathic response, and we know a bit about the objectification of human beings and women in particular around that. But the other thing, just before we do get into pornography, by way of I guess connecting parents a little bit that are listening and guardians that are listening to this podcast in around the impact of that, particularly on raising healthy boys. I'm interested in your thoughts about the kind of the cultural forces and I guess there's a word like morality that seems very unfashionable these days. But when we think about moral formation and we think about what's really at the heart of human beings as a collective, our desire to connect to other people, our inherent need to be close and to have intimate and safe relationships physically, emotionally, and spiritually. I mean, it seems to make it's kind of a no-brainer that there needs to be some kind of morality, guiding principles, ethics around that. But it just seems in the changes that we've had, and whether it's people's responses to institutions that maybe held the moral education like the church, and there's been a real change in that. But boy, it's almost like for us as parents and guardians now, there's a real cause and call for us to engage in moral formation, I think.
Yeah, and people might be more comfortable with using language around ethics or values, perhaps because the the way that the word morality has been used has been um, too often oppressive and restricting in harmful ways, not just in ways that are about shaping, um, better, safer, respectful communities. So I think at one level, there is a sense of the sort of philosophical paradigm is very individualistic. It's each to their own and do what you like, and the marketplace is sort of open and people can do what suits them, and that is in part a reaction to what have been for too long some pretty oppressive forces, including silencing of victims of sexual violence, for example, gender inequality, racism. I think there are a whole range of movements that have said enough is enough. It's not okay for this inequality and for these oppressions to be normalized and accepted. But they're not our only options. To have sort of rampant individualism that doesn't take account of, which also I think doesn't take account of those inequalities. Actually, that sort of individual focus can serve to reinforce exactly those pre-existing inequalities, which I think is part of what pornography does. Um, yeah, we don't have to choose between those things. I would hope that we can actually forge a type of society where respect and equality and creativity and a celebration of diversity, and it can be sort of shaped also by those broader community values, the importance of, yeah, so the individual and the community are not in competition necessarily, though there'll always be a tension between those things. I think we've got the balance wrong now and we had the balance wrong earlier.
Yeah, and finding those threads, and I guess people like yourself and the work that you do, just about how important it is to create new ways, new normals, in a sense, that are healthy and do enable those safer and more equitable relationships to be formed that are based on respect, as you say.
I think that it's also that those ways of relating have also always been there. It's about how much weight they're given. So, people have known how to be respectful of one another throughout human history, but we've also known how to hurt and harm and violate one another. And for me, it's partly about how we support, we make it easier for people to be better to each other in a way, how we create cultural environments and societal contexts in which respect, equality, you know, some freedoms and a lack of violence, they're the norms, not power over aggression towards inequalities, and some of the other, I think, harmful frameworks that are promoted too regularly. Where they have the upper hand, then we sort of set ourselves up for an unhealthy society and for unhealthy individuals.
Yeah. So let's talk about pornography and the impact, particularly on raising boys. I think one of the things that we've seen happen a lot is the normalization of pornography in our society and culture. We even use the word porn. We talk about, word porn or food porn, as if porn is just something that's, it's just, there's body porn, there's food porn, there's golf porn. It's this idea that's a little bit wicked and exciting and interesting, and it's breaking the rules, but it's increasingly normalized in so many different contexts. It's amazing. I mean, what have you seen in your work, and how do you deal with the issue on such a broad level? I mean, it seems to be everywhere.
So I think it's worth noting that pornography, people will often say, well, pornography's always existed. And there's been artwork, paintings, photography, video. What we've seen with the advent of the internet is an entirely different phenomenon. So never before in human history have people had a basically endless supply of an incredible smorgasbord of high definition imagery at the click of a button in anonymous, private sort of circumstances. Never before have a generation of young people grown up with small devices that they can access a whole world, a lifetime, many times over worth of pornography. So it's been normalized in part by its pervasiveness. It's incredibly accessible. It's marketed aggressively. You don't need to be looking for it to find it. For many young people, it's actually more difficult to avoid it than it is to see it. About half of young people were not looking for porn the first time they saw it. It's appealing at a number of levels, I suppose, but it's normal and healthy for young people and adults to be curious and interested in sexuality. We just haven't had this kind of content just there, at the end of our curiosity before. So young people are being exposed at very high rates. An Australian study conducted by Our Watch, the National Foundation for the Prevention of Violence Against Women and Their Children, found that almost half, 48% of boys have seen pornography by the age of 13, and almost half of girls have seen it by the age of 15. So, and also they looked at the levels of access and exposure, and what they found was that, consistent with other international research, that it's highly gendered. So young men are much more likely to use it often, to use it alone and in same-sex groups, to initiate its use, to pressure others to watch it. And Our Watch study found that over half, 56% of 15 to 20-year-old males use pornography at least weekly, with 1 in 6 reporting daily consumption. For young women, the stats were about 15% reported weekly use and only 1% daily use. So it's very much targeted at men, heterosexual men and gay men, and it is an incredibly kind of common experience for young men to be consuming it.
I read your paper that you wrote with Michael Flood, and that some of those statistics are there, even in that paper, and also even internationally. So it's certainly particularly in the West, it's a huge problem, and we keep seeing those numbers, which are obviously concerning for reasons that we'll go into. What are some of the things that you found that might, in your work, that surprise parents about this area and this work, other than the things that we've talked about just then?
Yeah, I think the levels of exposure are often quite surprising. I think the scale of the industry is one. So porn sites account for, depending on when you look at the data, but something like 3 in the top 15 websites in the world. During COVID, they were 3 of the top 10 sites during the sort of early waves of COVID, I should say. So that puts them under Google and Facebook, but above a whole range of things: LinkedIn, TikTok, Amazon, eBay, Netflix, heaps of very, very mainstream sites. And one of those sites reports regularly on its usage. They reported that in a single year, they had 42 billion visits to the site. So that's, about 6 for every human being on the planet for one of those websites. So the scale of it is mind-boggling, actually. I think that's one thing that often surprises people. Another thing that often surprises people is the nature of the content. So if you're not a consumer of pornography, or you don't consume mainstream pornography, and I should say that our work is focused on mainstream pornography, so it's not on erotica, it's on the kind of content that young people are mostly exposed to. Within that mainstream pornography, there are very common depictions of aggression, and that aggression is almost always directed towards women. So multiple studies have found something like 94 or 97% of incidents of aggression are directed towards women. And, it includes things like gagging, choking, spanking, verbal abuse, hair pulling. People are often very surprised at the prevalence of incest themes, or what the porn industry often refers to as family themes. A recent study found incest themes in 46% of the most popular videos. And if you look at the homepage of any of the most popular porn sites, without even looking at the porn, just looking at the titles that are on the homepage, you'll see stepmom, brother, sister, stepdaughter, etc. Multiple of those on the homepage. Non-consensual themes are also incredibly common. One study found that 35% of the most popular videos included something that might be considered non-consensual, and often the character in the porn is then shown to subsequently agree to what's happening. So this sort of quite insidious message that no doesn't mean no. It just means they haven't worked out yet that they would like to do that. And another study found that 12% of titles in the most popular porn across a large sample size described something that constitutes sexual violence. So forced sex, hidden cameras, she was asleep or drunk, or, unable to give consent. So that's that sort of normalization of significant levels of aggression. And this is not just in heterosexual porn. Those kinds of messages are replicated in, in gay porn, in trans porn, also to some extent in lesbian and bisexual porn as well.
So, and it's horrific. When you said earlier the mainstream versus erotica, what's the difference there?
So I think of erotica as being sexual content that, perhaps where everybody looks like they are genuinely enjoying what's happening, and it's, there's more equality. It's, if you think about porn as a bell curve, where at one end you have erotica, where people are nice to each other, and at the other end you have, snuff porn, where someone's killed at the end. The focus of our work is on the content in the center, because that's what most people watch, and certainly it's what most young people watch. And sometimes when there are discussions or debates about pornography, because it's worth noting that many people hold very strong views about pornography, and people can be very defensive of pornography as well as very critical of porn, so the whole range. But often when there are debates, people can be distracted by content that hardly anyone is seeing. So most young people are not seeing content that is equal, respectful, mutual. They're seeing content that is more likely to be the kind of material that I'm describing.
I think most people listening would understand the impact of this on the developing humans. But we do often hear the argument, so I'll raise it, about, well, look, it's just human beings, they're just bodies. What does it matter? It's people are expressing themselves as they want to express themselves. Sure, there's power things, but, people are choosing to be there. Like, I'm saying it because, it is an argument that's out there. Like, how as parents and guardians do we respond to those kinds of arguments? It sort of suggests, well, look, we've been doing this since day dot, and okay, sure, it's a bit more tech and everything's, there's much more of everything, so what does it matter?
I think the power of this kind of medium is something that it's useful for us to understand. So it's a very visceral, powerful medium that is appealing to a very basic part of us as human beings, our sexual interest and desire. Young people are seeing it often years before their first sexual experience. So, on average, young men are seeing it 3 years before their sexual experience with another human being, and young women are seeing it 2 years before theirs. And when we think back to the levels of, access and exposure that young people are having, particularly young men, that's a long time for pornography to be shaping your sexual tastes and expectations. For that repeated pairing of experiences of sexual arousal with pornographic imagery, it can lay down neural pathways. So our tastes, just like our tastes for food or drink or fashion, are all they're plastic. They're changeable. Not that anyone could be into anything, but we all can shape our tastes. I don't like coffee. If I was to drink it every day for a month or so, I would almost certainly acquire a taste for it. So in the same way, our sexual taste can be shaped, and young people are often seeing pornography. And for young men, many of them are regularly consuming pornography with a lack of counter reference points and without the ability then to shape their own sexuality, as freely as they might without having had that influence. So they're then engaging in their own sexual experiences with the backdrop of potentially years and potentially hundreds or thousands of experiences of masturbating to pornography. And as one of the young men we interviewed described, many of your early sexual experiences are like a monologue. It's about you and your pleasure, and you're watching and getting what you want from that sexual experience. When you're having sex with another person, it's a dialogue, and it needs to be a dialogue, and it's not all about you. But there's a concern that there's a real risk, and I hear many stories about this, that sort of it's all about me, and particularly that it's all about the male who's more likely to be the consumer. Mode, if you like, of engaging in sex is taken into those interpersonal experiences of sexuality. So that's kind of at a basic level, that not learning how to engage in a mutual way with a sexual partner, but also having their taste shaped. And part of what that means is a reinforcing of gendered stereotypes and roles, including for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans young people, a reinforcing and a kind of eroticizing of gender inequality, because the male in most porn, whoever their partner is, a male is generally the focus of the pleasure, although it looks as though the woman is being more pleasured in heterosexual porn because she's more expressive about it. The practices and the focus is on male pleasure. So pornography normalizes male dominance and female submission. It also normalizes and eroticizes gendered aggression, and it is shaping young people's sexual experiences. I hear this again and again, and it's also reflected in the literature. One of the really concerning things that has come up over the years of doing interviews with young people, and we've produced a couple of documentary films about these issues, but in my most recent round of interviews with young people, they talked about the normalization of sexual strangulation, or what's often referred to as choking, but the correct medical term is strangulation when it's external pressure. And young person after young person told me this has become a normal practice within sexual interactions, that either they or their peers are doing it, that there's an expectation that it is pleasurable, that you can do it safely, and kind of that what matters is that it's consenting. But then I've also interviewed medical experts with expertise in strangulation who say there is no safe way to strangle. And they're very, very concerned about the normalization of sexual strangulation. And there's this huge gap between what young people are learning from porn and from social media and other, from their peers and partners. So it becomes this kind of sea of influences that are saying that sexual strangulation is normal. There's this huge gap between that and what the medical experts are telling us. The data coming out of the US is extraordinary, that in a very big sample of nearly 5,000 survey respondents, 64% of women, 29% of men, and 55% of transgender or non binary people said they'd been choked during sex. Almost half of men said they'd done that to someone, and a quarter of them had done it in their most recent sexual encounter. So, what we're hearing in our interviews with young people is reflected in the international data, and it's not just us that's hearing it here. Sexual assault services, family violence services, also a whole range of different people are reporting that this increase. So I think that's a particular example of some of the ways that porn is influencing people individually, but then also influencing society and culture and norms. So it's reinforced. They get the same messages in other parts of society as well, on television programs and on social media, etc.
And it might be an oversimplification to say this, but it's like these young people are being hardwired in terms of you're using the analogy of the diet. So they're hardwired with this diet, and this diet is now suggesting things that are at such an extreme level where, to someone hearing this, like our audience and myself for the first time, about the kinds of things that are going on, it's a huge concern that we have these kids with unfettered access being able to, or being educated in a way that, really is leading to this great, at a medical level, at a humanitarian level. It's mind-blowing, really, listening to what you're saying.
And I think that's part of the challenge, actually, that for many of us involved in caring for and supporting young people, our lives might be a long way away from understanding what's going on there and, making sense of it, that we don't know how to support them effectively if we don't know what's going on for them. I delivered professional learning recently for some teachers at a school, and I spoke about strangulation. I came away from the interviews deciding that I needed to talk about it, that, whenever there's opportunity and context. And so I talked about the literature, I talked about the experiences, and just before I was about to play some interview content of young people describing it, one of the staff, who's a health teacher, said, "But young people are not idiots. Like, they know that this is dangerous. They're surely not doing this." And my response was, absolutely, young people are not idiots. It's not that they're idiots. It speaks to the power of the influences shaping them. And, we all are influenced by factors around us outside of our individual tastes and interests. And then I played the interview footage of young person after young person describing this normalization. And I think that gap in our understanding and what's going on for young people, we need to close that gap, because otherwise they are left alone in influences that are like, amongst themselves to be kind of navigating this.
Absolutely. And even like as someone who's taught health and, works in research and gender as I do, listening to it, I'm like, wow, there is an initial sense of hopelessness, isn't there around it? So what are some of the things that we can do as parents, like as a white hetero male, how do I, from a dad listening in that category, and lots of different parents, different walks of life and, sexual orientations and so on, how do we start these conversations to be alongside, young people who are, as you said, intelligent and, have that fundamental desire to connect and be intimate and be safe, but yet they've been hardwired to have this, to experiment and, to do these things that are actually really unhealthy?
I think to start with, it's important to note that we can't just leave this to parents. So parents absolutely have a role to play, but it's very unfair for parents to be required to address the influence of a multi-billion-dollar global industry that is beamed into the devices that we and our kids carry around with us all the time. So there's a need for a structural response as well. And I recognise and acknowledge the risk of people feeling disempowered by the size of the issue. So part of the response is to say we need to address this in multiple reinforcing ways across society, not just in a particular space. Having said that, I think that there are things that we can do as parents, as educators, and in our other roles. We can start by learning about the issues and, doing some reading, talking to people, thinking through what are the issues, and how do we understand them and want to approach them? Most of us have not had this modeled by our own parents or teachers, how to have a conversation about pornography. And if we did, then depending on your age, it might have been an entirely different type of porn that we had that conversation about. So be prepared, do the thinking, do the kind of personal work in ourselves so that we're not bringing our fear, judgment, blame, or shame. We're approaching the conversation with a curiosity, an openness, not making assumptions about young people's experiences. So it's not uncommon for young people to watch porn and potentially to watch it often, but not feel good about that, to feel a level of discomfort themselves. And so, regardless, that what they don't need us going in there saying, you're bad, this is wrong. They need us to help understand what's going on for them and support them to think critically. I think that conversations about pornography they obviously need to be about porn, but they're ultimately about values. They're about inviting young people to think about, who they want to be in their sexuality, what they want to allow them, what they want to shape them, to allow to shape them in their sexuality. They're about supporting them to think critically about the influences that might shape them and inviting them to think positively about concepts like respect, mutuality, consent, things that seem basic, but that are actually quite radical in the current environment. The idea that you might only engage in a sexual interaction when everybody involved really likes what's happening, they want it to be happening, they feel good about it at the time, and they feel good about it afterwards. The kind of communication that you'd need to do to make sure that that's the case. For young men, I think there are expectations that they feel around knowing what they're doing, being in control. That there's not the same sort of fumbling first experiences where no one knew anything because they didn't have access to this content. I think often young men feel a burden, a sense of being able to perform what they see in porn, and that very distanced kind of hyper masculinity that is not about engaging intimately or being vulnerable. So we need to help them think critically about those modes of masculinity that are obviously not just in porn, they're in all sorts of places in broader society. If they hope for a sexuality that is fulfilling and connected in some sort of way, whether it's short term or long term relationships, then they need to be able to be vulnerable and to communicate well. If they want to be a good sexual partner, someone who their partner enjoys and thinks, that was great, I'd like to do that again with them, then learning from porn is not a good place to learn that. You're not going to learn safety, respect, mutuality, and consent. So I think entering conversations with young people with a respect for them, with a very deliberate affirmation of sexuality and of their sexuality, of that you respect that they are sexual beings, and affirm that that's a great thing. And of course, some people don't want to be sexual, and that's fine as well. But it's part of human sexuality. It's part of kind of being a human being that most of us are interested in sex. So we want to very consciously affirm that, and then invite them to think critically about what they want that to look like. Would they like to shape their own sexuality with someone perhaps that they care about? And or what do they think about having it shaped by a global industry that couldn't care less about them, that wants to make a profit, and that profits from the reinforcing of inequalities, of racism, of misogyny, of homophobia.
And so I think in listening to that, what I'm really taking from it is about that, firstly, that connection, the affirmation around, people's interest. Because I think one of the things that comes up even at a teaching level is that people are interested. There's a curiosity and, the desire and, all of those things. And then very quickly, I think, particularly in the male space, there's the shame and the guilt, and that seems to get kind of drive particular behaviours, which actually I think often sadly reinforce. It becomes a cycle of disconnection because of the shame, and then it's like, well, people can't actually then form meaningful relationships to be the kind of partner that they would like to be. And also, I think, as you're saying, to think critically about, where's the information coming from? And that is a universal skill that we need for the era that we live in. And I'm also conscious of your website, It's Time We Talk, which is great. And it's got some definitely got things for parents to get involved in, and some things that we can do there. And also, I think your comments around, it's not just parents. I mean, that's affirming to hear. And, we do need to be thinking about, I know you've been writing and commenting recently about all sorts of things that are happening even at a national level around sexual violence in particular, but also about schools and the role that schools play. Obviously many schools now are, adopting respectful relationships curricula and, doing, moving in the right direction in some of these things. But I mean, for you as if you're a discerning parent and looking at schools, what would you be thinking about in terms of, well, is this school, what would you want to see? Is it something that needs to be taught? Is it really explicitly put out in the, on the website? What level do schools need to get to, do you think, if you're from a parent's perspective?
I think schools need to be addressing pornography as an integrated component of broader relationships and sexuality education. Um, and I talk about 3 different learning approaches that schools can take and also that parents can take. And the first is a foundational learning approach, and that's where we support children and young people to develop related competencies without ever mentioning pornography. So critical media literacy, respectful relating skills, online safety, knowledge and behaviours, body protection, help seeking knowledge and behaviours. So a range of related competencies that become the scaffolding on which we can have the conversations about pornography. Then, and I think thinking critically about your sources is part of that as well. Whether we're thinking about how to vote, where we get medical information. Excuse me, I'll say that again. Whether we're thinking about how to vote, or where we get medical information, or where we learn about sexuality, then thinking about the robustness and the trustworthiness of the sources that we're seeking that information from is important. So we can do that foundational learning approach. Then an integrated learning approach is where we do mention pornography, but we do so in the context of a broader conversation. So we might be talking about, where do you learn about about gender, expectations around gender. And we might talk about family and peers and different parts of society and media and mention pornography as part of that. Or we might talk about pressure and consent and talk about pressure to drink alcohol, pressure to watch pornography, pressure to create sexual imagery of yourself, those kind of things. And then finally, a specific learning approach is where we're overtly having a conversation about pornography specifically, the messages it conveys, what we think about its influences, what we can do when we're pressured to watch it, etc. So I think that schools need to be actively engaging in all 3 of those layers of education. They also, we know this is the case with any wellbeing issue, it needs to be a whole of school approach. So it's not enough to just have some health teachers talking about pornography in a lesson as part of sexuality education. That's really important, and that's the best place to have those conversations, I think, in that interactive, participatory learning style that we have in health, where young people can grapple with the issues, not just listen to a lecture from a guest speaker, but actually really sit with the issues, grapple with it, integrate that thinking over a series of lessons as part of broader conversations. Schools need to also be equipping their staff well, not throwing a teacher in who's not done the thinking or had the opportunity to get the professional learning and support. They need to be engaging with their parent community, working in partnership with parents to have these conversations. We need to ensure that schools' organisation, ethos, culture and environment are reinforcing of the same messages. So if in class, in health, you're critiquing gender stereotypes, and then in other parts of the school, you're normalising and giving value to gendered stereotypes, then that's going to undermine the messaging. And we also need to engage with the broader community. So schools also shouldn't need to do this alone. Schools, I think, need the support of people who bring expertise and can help equip staff, who can help with those referral pathways for students who, for example, disclose that they've had experiences of sexual assault that are related to these, pressure from what they've seen in porn, for example, or a young person who describes feeling that their use of porn is out of control, they're not comfortable with it, and they, would like some support to work out how to stop or cut back on their use of porn. So, yeah, I think there are a whole range of elements to a whole school approach, and a school needs support from the broader systems also to do that. We kind of, I think sometimes there's a risk that we think of health as a side issue, a topic that's not as important as mathematics or English or science. But actually, the kinds of themes that we address in health are very critical for our experience of life and the world. The quality of our relationships, of our interactions with other people, of our own health and well-being are so central to our experiences of life. And I think we need to give these kinds of topics the resourcing and time and focus that they deserve, given the role that they can play.
What is it to be a good man these days?
I think to be a good man means being respectful, kind, to be interested in people's well-being and in justice. I think it means being a good human being. I think it necessarily means asking some hard questions about the models of masculinity that have been provided and pushed. It's a really interesting time on that front, and I think a challenging time for boys and men, because on the one hand, they're given messages that gender equality is valued and important, and that they need to act respectfully and not make assumptions about the position that they'll have in society, in the family, in all sorts of contexts. On the other hand, there are still some incredibly powerful influences normalizing gender inequality, normalizing models of masculinity that say that you should be tough and in control and dominant, that you can't express your emotions or be seen to be vulnerable or treat people, women, gay men, trans people, whoever it is, as equals. So I think it's not surprising if young men are feeling an internal conflict of who am I? How am I meant to be? Because I think they're getting competing messages. But being a good human being means being prepared to grapple with those questions, and I think it's about respect and equality.
And if you had a story you could tell a 14-year-old boy and he'd listen, what would the story be?
Well, I think if the story's on this topic, I think the story would be that sexuality can be great. It can be fantastic, one of the best parts of human experience, but it can also be awful, the most horrific parts of human experience, and everything in between. And the factors that make a difference are things like respect, mutuality, consent, perhaps also love. And it's worth thinking about those themes and trying to weigh up the influences that shape you around your own sexuality, and to be courageous enough to make choices that might be different from the norms around you, because you want to value being a respectful, sexual partner, intimate partner. So I think the story needs to be affirming and invitational, but also inviting that critique and pointing to the possibility of something fantastic, but only if you work for it. You're not going to just fall into most people now are not going to fall into fantastic sexual experiences. You actually need to unlearn the kinds of messages that you get in porn and deliberately learn models that are respectful.
Maree Crabbe, thank you so much for your time today. It's been confronting, it's been illuminating, it's been inspiring, you know, to hear and see the work that you're doing, and I think the wisdom that you've got from so many different interviews, research projects, walking alongside people and really taking up the challenge in this area to think critically. And, you know, so much of what you said at the end about the story, I think is your story. So from all of us here at Understanding Boys, thank you very much for your time today.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We hope you've enjoyed this Understanding Boys podcast. Make sure you subscribe on your podcast app and please leave us a review to help grow the community. For more information about the podcast, please visit understandingboys.com.au. Until next time, thanks for listening.